Welcome to Music Monday episode 4. In this video I will be discussing intervals. Most of what I talk about will be written down in this right hand section here, or what I will be talking about at the moment will be based off of what is written on the screen at the moment. So if I'm discussing some things, going over some topics, if you look over here on the right hand side, there should be some dialogue describing what's going on, as well as I kind of took some notes to further expand on these topics to help you understand it even more. So it could be a big help if you're confused at any point in this video to pause the video and to read the dialogue and the additional notes that I've made about these topics. I have spent a good amount of time trying to make this as easily understood as possible, but this is not a topic that for most people they're gonna understand it by the end of this video. This is something that for most it will take a lot of studying and thinking about on your own time. So the point of this video is to teach you about intervals from a beginner level to a more advanced level. So it would be good to watch the whole video even if you are a beginner or not, because your brain will probably pick up on a lot whether you realize it or not. So then if you go back and you study these intervals more on your free time and you understand them more, you can go back and you can watch the more advanced topics that are found further on in this video. Then if you already watched those the first time, now when you go back a second time and you watch them, you're going to be more familiar with the topics that are being taught. For a lot of this, I will first explain the rules, the things you need to follow for intervals. Then I will show you on the piano to make this less confusing. So in the beginning, there's going to be a lot of explaining, and then at a certain point, there's going to be a lot more on the piano. So we talked about this stuff, now it's actually do it on the piano, as well as breaking it down further to really understand it. What I mean by that is I'm going to go a step further. I'm going to go even past what I did with just explaining the rules, showing on piano. We're going to break everything down. We're going to understand it more. So let's get into it. Intervals. Intervals are the relationship between a note and another note. This is also known as the intervallic relationship of notes. I'm going to discuss different types of intervals, including quantities and qualities of intervals, and how to identify these quantities and qualities, as well as a lot more. So when we look at the word quantity, someone says, what's the quantity of spaghetti you eat in a week? Okay, so that's associated with an amount of something, and if we're gonna associate the amount with a number, that can easily be done. So how much spaghetti do you eat in a week? If someone asks you, oh, I eat about one bag worth every week or something. So if you eat one bag of spaghetti every week, then you can tell someone a quantity of spaghetti you eat every week. So what I'm trying to say is that quantity can be referred to numbers and amounts of things. So when we look at quantity, that helps us understand what's going on with intervals. As you see, we're looking at all numbers here. We have the 1, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. We're going to stop at 8. And with these are all numbers. So when you think quantity, just think quantity number. So with number, think a number that expresses the interval. Okay? And that's the quantity. Then from quantity, we go to quality of interval. The reason for this is because our quantities actually plug in to our qualities. So certain numbers are going to fit into certain qualities. So let's look at the qualities. We have perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished. I do not capitalize minor and diminished, if you see, to make it a quick reference point about the intervallic relationship. That'll make more sense by the end of this. As you see, we have minor and we have diminished, and both of those are not capitalized, but perfect, major, and augmented I capitalized to also give you a reference point about their intervallic relationship, but that'll be explained more. The reason for stopping at the number 8 is because after 8 it repeats. And in this context, if you want to know exact context what we're talking about, technically we're going to be talking about a diatonic scale, and we're actually, to really sum it up, we're working in the A minor scale. But you don't need to know that. All you need to know is we're going to be working with the notes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then again on A where it repeats, and we're not going to have any flats or sharps. So essentially that's what you need to know. But if you want to know the technical stuff, then we could say that I'm working in the key of C major, but I'm working in the 6th mode, which is starting on the 6th degree of C major, and because of that, now I have the A minor scale, also known as the A Aeolian scale in its form. Everything in this beginning section will be explained better throughout this lesson, and I also want to explain that there are going to be some topics that are taught in this lesson that maybe won't be able to make sense of at the moment. But it doesn't really matter if you can make sense of it at the moment. It matters more if you're actually just paying attention and if you're listening to what I'm saying, because a lot of this stuff could even be certain seeds that are planted in your brain, let's say, that'll grow at a certain point later in time. So it's always good just to listen to what's going on, even if it doesn't make that much sense. Maybe even watch it a second time, try to make sense of it. But don't worry if it doesn't make all that much sense right now, and hopefully most of this stuff will make more sense by the end of this video, because this video will get quite expansive, and in the beginning I'm going to be explaining a lot of things, but then I'm going to further in the video explain all those things that I explained more in depth, so things should start actually connecting, making more sense, and it should be pretty good. So let's look at the word quantity and quality a little further. So we look at the quantity refers to the interval itself and the amount of natural notes it takes to get from one note to another. So when we're counting up quantity, we're going to use natural notes. So if we want to know if something is, let's say, an A and a B, we're going to count A and then B. And with the quantity, when we're counting up natural notes, know that we start on our 1, and our first one is known as our 1, let's say. So when we're counting from, like I said, A to B, we have our A1 and our B is 2. So it's good to know this. And as you see, it's the natural notes. It's no flats or sharps, because you don't need to worry about that when you're just looking at the quantity. So even if this was A flat to D sharp or something crazy or whatever you have, you could look at it, and just to know the quantity itself, what the number is, you'd still say that would be a 4th. Even if it was, like I just said, A flat to the D sharp or whatever, no matter what quality of, like if this is sharpened or flattened or anything, you just look at the note to the next note. However, when we are looking at different qualities of intervals, we're looking at kind of like families where certain relationships between two notes are grouped, and by those relationships between two notes, I'm talking about the quantities of intervals. So our quantities of intervals are basically going to fit into certain families, which are called the qualities. Okay? So below are pairs of notes that can be categorized in the certain families, but I'm not going to categorize them in the families quite yet, because that is going to take a few steps. All this stuff is going to have to build on itself, so we're going to get there. But first, we're going to talk about the actual intervals themselves that can fit there before we fit them there. Okay, so think of an imaginary bottom note on these intervals as 1. And this is because 1 will be the number that we are counting from to reach our next note. So I'm going to be using A as 1. Okay? So for example, I'm going to say 1 is A, 1 to 1. We're going to look here, and we're going to go from the 1 to the 1, we're going to go A to A. So if I played 2 A's, that would be the 1 to 1. And remember, this is an imaginary 1, so normally that 1 wouldn't be there, and you just see the other one, the last one. So let's go a little further. We have 1 to 2, which is A to B. So 1 to 2 is telling us A to B, but how that would normally be written would just be 2. Okay, so you'd see 2, and you're going to have a second of A is what the context would be, and you'd say, okay, well, where you're starting from is always your 1, so you think 1, 2, and you just are counting up these natural notes, like notes in your alphabet with no flats or sharps, so just A, B, okay, so we have that 2, and then furthermore, we plug in 1 to 3, we have C, we go to 1 to 7, we have A to G, okay? And then we go to the 1 to 8, which takes us back to A, 1 octave up. So here's a lower version of that A, and here's now a higher version of that A. So to kind of let you hear that. But when it is described as an interval, kind of like I was just saying, the imaginary 1 isn't there anymore. So now we call the interval by its number name with certain suffixes called ordinal indicators. So ordinal indicator is a fancy word for describing the suffixes nd, rd, and th, as in you have your second, third, and your fourth. So the example right here, rewritten, would look like this. So for example, we have again, 1 is A, but it's the imaginary 1 isn't there anymore. So we have 1 is A to A, it's 2 A's being played. A second would be an A and a B being played. A third would be, see, A to C, and we go to our seventh, which would be the A to G, and our eighth would be A to A. So when someone's telling you it's a seventh, they wouldn't just tell you it's a seventh because you'd have no idea. They'd tell you it's a seventh of A, or it's an A7 or whatever. They'd tell you there'd be a context from which note it's going to be started from. So let's look at that a little bit on the piano just to understand this. So we have an A and a B, so that is our second, okay? So because it's a second, we have the notes A and B, and that's what makes it a second, okay? And this is really important just to really kind of really get this in your brain, that because now that we have A to C, we have a third, so we have A, B, C, and don't worry about the qualities for now. We're just going to be talking about the quantities for right now. So now we go to D, A, B, C, D, so now we have 4, and all we did was count from A up 4. So we can keep doing that. And of course, to be considered a seventh, you'd have to count up those 7 notes, and that would now be considered a seventh. It's just very important to understand this, okay? So now for a little bit of some more technical stuff. When we look at the ones, we're going to call ones unison because it is an interval consisting of 2 notes in unison. So if 2 notes that are A and A are being played at the same time and they're the same pitch or octave, it's going to be the same exact note. There's not going to be a lower version or a higher version. It's going to be the same exact sounding note. And because of this, it's still going to be written as a 1, but when we look at that, we're going to call it unison. While when we have an eighth, we still have A to A. But A to A is now an octave because there's a lower A and a higher A in this case. This is built from ascending 8 notes up our scale. Okay, I'm calling it the diatonic scale if you want to know this. That's the scale that I'm using. It's a 7-note scale that follows the pattern starting from the major scale, and then from there you can create modes and such, which I'm using the 6th mode of the C major scale. But enough of that. The first note is 1. Okay? So because of our first note being 1, we call it the 8th, you see, because it's going up those 8 notes. But we don't want to just call it an 8th. We want to look at it and we want to know that it's an octave because we're going to be calling it an octave. So we're going to label it as 8VE instead of 8TH to highlight the fact that it is an octave. So we can quickly look at the 8VE and just know, oh, it's an octave, because the VE comes from the last 2 letters of octave. So certain intervals fall under major and minor qualities, while other intervals follow perfect and sometimes diminished or augmented qualities. Okay? And there's a lot more to this, but on a simple level, I'm just going to explain it like that for now. I'm going to just discuss major, minor, and perfect for right now. Below are examples of certain intervals that would fit under these different qualities. So we have our quantity of our interval, our number, correlating to our quality of interval. Okay, so let's get into it. So to plug it in, we have a perfect unison, we have a perfect fourth, we have a perfect fifth, and we have a perfect eighth. So to talk about this a little more, we don't have a major unison or a minor unison, and there's no major or minor fourth, fifth, or octave. Okay? But when we're looking at major or minor, something kind of interesting about it is they share the same intervals, which are the second, third, sixth, and seventh. The only difference is them being either major or them being minor, the same intervals. Okay? So then again, if we take the major and the minor intervals and we think, can we make a perfect second, third, sixth, or seventh? No, we cannot. So that's where these are plugged into different areas. As you can see, the quantity is now plugged into a certain quality. There's several times where I will be probably saying this during this video, but next is where things can start to get confusing. Augmented is a note one semitone above a certain interval that we already discussed. This only works for certain intervals. Since one semitone above a minor is a major, our minor does not work if we want to make it augmented. So let's look at that. So I'm going to look at a minor second, and I'm going to go one semitone up and look at what that becomes. A major second. Well, that didn't become augmented at all. However, if we want one semitone up, that would become augmented, but look at what note it falls on. Well, that falls on C and now it becomes a third because we're counting up just the quantity. So we have A, B, C. So how is that an augmented second? Well, it would be a context. So certain contexts we'd say, actually one augmented second, and I'm going to consider this sound an augmented second, and this is where things get kind of funny. It's going to be explained furthermore, but this is kind of just the basic level of it. And so we have A and C. How do we create this or turn this into what we want is our second, but we wanted an augmented second? So we're going to look at what would one note up from B be? Well, that would be C. But how do we keep B, B, but land here? Well, we could call it B sharp, because there is no such thing as a B sharp in our actual piano. There's no note for that. But if we technically called this E sharp, well, technically that would be now an augmented second, because we went one step above our major second. So if this was labeled our B sharp, then we'd have an augmented second. Okay? So now we're looking at diminished. Diminished means one semitone below certain intervals. So since one semitone below a major is a minor, our major cannot become diminished. Okay? So let's look at a major third. We have a major third, and we have A, and we have D flat. Okay? Just think about the fact that it's a major third and that now we're going to go one step down and look what it becomes. We have A and C, and we have a minor third. And this actually should be called C sharp if you caught that, because D flat would actually make it the quantity of a fourth if we think about A, B, C, D. So if that should be written, if it's called a major third, actually as C sharp. So now we have A to C, we have the minor third, but if we take a minor third and we go one step down, we can create a diminished third, but look what it becomes right now. It just becomes a major second, but the note that we're looking at is we went from A to C, went from A to B. So we could also call this B, if we want to keep this note B, a C, but we want it over here in the spot of the B. Well, what's one step down from a C? C flat, which normally you don't have C flat. So if we called this C flat in that context, then we would have a diminished third. Okay? And that, if that doesn't make all that much sense right now, don't worry, because that is a little more of a confusing topic, but it's a very important topic, and I think that it should not be skipped. You typically do not see augmented or diminished seconds, thirds, sixth, and seventh. And if you remember, those are the intervals that can be major or minor. So in other words, you typically do not see augmented or diminished versions of certain intervals that would already be coming from a state that would be major or minor. But it is good to know how to construct them and what they are. They do come in handy in certain situations, such as when wanting to describe an interval as a certain type, but when working with the qualities that you're given. As I was just showing you, we wanted to create a augmented second. We had a minor third, but we wanted to create an augmented second. So that was where we had to call notes certain different names. So that's typically something that's not really done as often. So if you noticed, our diminished third is just a minor second, but I called B C flat instead of calling it B, so then it became a third when counting for quantity. Because remember, in quantity, we're just counting up those natural notes, which are no flats and no sharps. So I'm counting from A to C, I'm going up A, B, C, so that's called a third. And the augmented third takes the same amount of notes as a perfect fourth, if you notice that. But instead of calling it C to F, I am going to call it C to E sharp. This keeps it a third and not a fourth. Okay? So it's because we're counting up the quantity, and we're counting up quantity. Even if it's C to E sharp, we're just going to go C, D, E. Okay? That leads us to the most common types of augmented and diminished intervals, which come from the perfect intervals. So to get an augmented interval, you go up one semitone from a perfect interval, and to get a diminished interval, you go down one semitone from a perfect interval. So just to make a little more sense, as you can see, as a first thing, our augmented is going up, so it's A, it's kind of like a more positive, and then our diminished is going down, so it's the lowercase d, just to kind of help you look at it quicker and think that. Next, when naming an interval, make sure the interval correlates with the number of natural notes it takes to make it. So I just went over this, but go over it a little more. Since A to E is a fifth, if we go A to E, we would call a diminished fifth A to E flat. Okay? So let's rewrite this real quick here, how we'd normally see this if we were looking at this. So normally if we were looking at this, we're going up a fifth, but in semitones. Okay? So we're going up a fifth in semitones. We're just thinking A, B, C, D, E, but we're looking at the semitones, so it's on that number 7. So this is going a little bit past what we're talking about now. So I have A to E, and if I wanted to create a fifth that was diminished, I would go down one. And to create a fifth that was augmented, I would go up one. Okay, so we have our A to E, and we're going down one. Okay, since we go from E down one, if we land on D sharp, that's no longer a fifth anymore. Because A, B, C, D, that's now a fourth. So if we want to make this D sharp the quality of an actual fifth, we'd have to call it something different. So what could we call it? We can now call it E flat, because that's one semitone down from our E. So we have E flat, A to E flat, we now have a diminished fifth. Furthermore, if we go from E and we land on our F, we can't land on an F and still call it a fifth. Because if you count up 1 from our E, now we have a sixth. So I go from F, what would one semitone up from an E be? Well, that would be an E sharp. So when naming an interval, make sure the quantity of interval correlates with the number of natural notes that it takes to make it. Furthermore, unisons and octaves consist of the same note, so there's no such thing as an augmented or diminished version of these intervals. So when we look at augmented and diminished, we have our second, third, fourth, 5th, 6th, and 7th that can be used for both of those. So therefore, all of our intervals besides the unison and the octave are able to become augmented or diminished. But there's a difference in certain intervals. So as I was showing you, the augmented or diminished 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th are a completely different concept than an augmented or diminished 4th and 5th. So for now, I'm just going to write the interval without a suffix nd, rd, th, or ve, as in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or octave. Below is normally how it's going to be notated, where it said now. So as we look, before is what I was doing, is I was saying our unison, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and now we have the same thing new look, like when they come out with a new cereal or whatever and they say it's the same thing inside but it's a new look on the box or whatever. Well, we have a new look but it's the same thing. So we're still going to call it a unison, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and our octave. Okay? But now it's just written simpler. So since after the 8 it repeats, we will not be going past the 8 in these lessons, but just know that you can keep going, for example, up an 11th. So an 11th of A would be D, because if you're just counting up A to D, and at G it repeats back at A, you notice that you're landing back on a D. So you can still have an 11th interval, but that's a different topic, so we're not going to talk about that for now. Next, there are such things as harmonic intervals and melodic intervals, and there's a difference between them. So harmonic intervals are when two notes are being played at the same time, while melodic intervals are when two notes are being played one after another. There are ascending or descending melodic intervals. Ascending is going from one note that you started from and going to the next note. Then descending is going from one note and going down to the next note. Okay? When you create a melodic interval, whether it is ascending or descending, you would still read it at the bottom note up. This is because you are still using intervals that were created from a scale that is ascending from a lower note to a higher note. For example, we have this C major scale, and this is consisted of the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. The low note C ascends to the higher note B in a series of whole and half steps in a precise order of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. You get this pattern and you plug it in to the chromatic scale starting on the note C, and that's how you get your C major scale. This is the major scale pattern. Okay, so all of this stuff makes a lot of sense when we're looking at our sheet music, when we're talking about the descending and ascending notes, because whether your note ascends or descends, when you're counting up the staff, you still have the same preset notes on each line and space. So as you can see, these notes that are on the staff, they're not changing. We have certain notes attributed to each line. For example, we have this bottom note is our C, and this note here that's on the first line is our E. So no matter which order we're going to be counting in, it's still an E here and it's still a C here. And because of that, the note in the middle of a C to an E is D, because we go C, D, E. So if you think about it, whether we are descending or ascending, we still have the same interval. We still have a third. And as you can see here, I kind of wrote that down here even on the notes so you can see it. We have an E here, and it's going down, descending to our C. Okay? So it'd be the same thing if we got our C and we ascended to our E, we have a third. So this can seem confusing at first, but it's just the fact that if you ascend melodically, you're counting from the low note to the high note. And when you descend melodically, you're still counting from the low note to the high note, but the high note comes first. Okay? So if we look furthermore, when intervals are built in harmony, they reveal that they read from the bottom note up. So if you're confused about a descending interval, just think about if it was stacked and how you would read that. So if we did look at the E to C, and then we thought, okay, well if it was just stacked, then we'd have a third. Okay? As you see, I wrote this again. I said this is where things can get confusing. Okay, this leads us to counting down notes instead of counting up notes. So if you take the same interval, for example, a fifth, and you count up a fifth, you'll get a different note than if you count down a fifth. You'll get a different end result from the same interval. Let's look at this. So we're going to call our A our 1. So if our A is our 1 and we count down 5, we end up landing on D. But if we start on A and we count up 5, we land on E. It is good to know this, but to make it less confusing, it's good to start thinking about it as counting up. As most people could probably agree, it's easier to count up the alphabet versus down. So counting A, B, C, D versus Z, Y, X, and W. When you are more familiar with the rest of these topics that I'm going to be teaching, the fact of counting down is not going to seem as difficult and confusing. You're just going to understand this stuff more. So now for these lessons on intervals, I will be only counting up when I'm talking about intervals, unless I mention that I'm talking down. Here I have the chromatic scale, and the chromatic scale is going to go from 0 to 12. So let's talk about this and explain this a little more. When we're counting up our natural notes, remember, like if we're counting up from a C to an E, we're just going to go C, D, E. However, if we're counting up chromatically, what's going to happen when we count up chromatically, which is something that we're going to need to know how to do, is that we do not start our 1 on that note that we are starting on. We want to know an A to an A sharp. Well, we're going to, no matter what, call A as 0. So if we go up to an A sharp, that would be a 1. Furthermore, if we want to go up to 4, we would have to count up, and we want to go up from A. We'd start an A, but then we'd start counting on the next chromatic up. So A sharp, B, there's no B or E sharp, so then you go from there. A sharp, B, C, C sharp. So now we're going to look at the number of semitones and basically how they correlate to the minor or major and how they also correlate to the quantity. So I'm going to start on 0 and then I'm going to go up from there all the way to 12. I'm going to describe each one. So first I have a unison. So unison would consist if I'm playing 2 of the same notes. So sadly, there are no 2 of the same exact A notes on a piano, so we're just going to imagine 2 of these being played at the same time. Next, if we go up 1 semitone, our next possible step up, we go from A, we land on B flat, 1 semitone up, now we have a minor second. Next, if we go up 1 more semitone, now we have an A to a B, which is a major second. As you notice, we're still calling it a second if it's B flat or if it's B. And the reason is because it's still the note B. So we're still counting from A to B. It's still a second. Okay? The qualities are just changing. So now we have C, which is a minor third. And then if we go up 1 semitone from there, we have what should be called a C sharp, but they're calling it a D flat right now. But just think of it as a semitone up from C is going to be C sharp. Then if we go up additionally 1 semitone from there, now we have a perfect fourth landing on D. And again, we're just going up A, B, C, D, and that's why it's a fourth. If we go up 1 more semitone, we actually have our augmented fourth now. As I was saying, if you go up 1 semitone from a perfect interval, then it becomes augmented. So we just went up 1 interval from a perfect, and now it's augmented. So our next one is a perfect fifth. Okay? So now if we went to that same note we were just at, if we went 1 semitone below a perfect interval, remember what that is. So that would also be called a diminished fifth, as well as being called an augmented fourth. These 2 notes that are different names but the same thing are called enharmonics. Next, if we go up from that perfect fifth, which is our 7 semitones. Then we're going to go up 8 semitones to our minor 6th. Okay? And now we're going to stay on A to F, but we're going to go up 1 more semitone to F sharp. So now we have a major 6th. Furthermore, another semitone, minor 7th, A to G. We're going to stay G, but now we're going to make it 1 semitone larger. So now we have G sharp. They're calling it A flat. Those are, again, those enharmonics, but we're going up 1 semitone from our G, so we're going to a G sharp, and that's a major 7th, which has 11 semitones, which then brings us to our 12 semitones, which takes us to our perfect octave. As you can see, all that is written here as a reference if you want to look at it and if you want to reference it, but I did not write down the diminished or augmented. So for a little homework, if you want to do this and leave the answer in the comments, feel free. It'd probably be a good exercise for you to exercise intervals and understand this topic more. Okay, something good to know is how to invert an interval. So this can easily be done with the number 9. So we're going to look at A to C counting up. So if we have A to C counting up, A, B, C, we have a third. But if we count A to C down, we have a 6th, okay? And just to make that visual, if you want to pause the video, you can see that we have A to C going down, and that creates the 6th. So now if we get our interval and we subtract it from the number 9, this is what happens. We get our 9, we subtract it by our third, and that gives us a 6th. So as you can see, to invert the interval, we just subtract this number 9. So we had a third, subtracted by 9, that gave us the 6th. Again, if we have our number 9, and we subtract 6 from that, so we go 9 minus 6, then it gives us a third. So we have a 6th, we want to invert it, take 9 minus 6, it gives us 3. Okay, so counting down from A to C uses the same steps as counting up from C to A. So if we look at, we have A down to C. Well, it's the same thing if we're just thinking C up to A. Okay, so one might find it easier just to count up from C when trying to find a 6th in that scenario. If you know A to C is a third, then you can quickly think that 9 minus 3 equals 6. So then you know that you're dealing with a 6th when you're going up from C to A, since it's just the opposite or inverted direction. Then you can double check by counting up from C. Or an even quicker way would be to use the circle of thirds as a context. So we're going to think of a C major triad. It's C, E, G. So what we have is a 1, a 3, and a 5. Now we can think to get a 6th, we just go up 1 note from the 5. So we have a C, we have C, E, G, that gives us the 5th, and then from there it goes plus 1 is our 6th. So we just think our 5th, G, plus 1 more, G, next note, A. So we have 6th. So we found our 6th by just making a C triad and going up 1 note. To find our 7th, we just go up 1 more step in the circle of thirds, of course. So furthermore, to find the 4th, we just think up 1 note up from the 3rd. So if we think C to E, then 1 note up from E is F. To double check, reference the next step in the circle of thirds and make sure your note falls in between that. So if we're looking at our 4th, we're going to think C, E, and G. What is in the middle of E and G? Well, that's an F. E, F, G. So we just clarified the fact that yes, this is a 4th. When we invert intervals, something interesting happens. The qualities flip, except if it is a perfect interval. So originally, we have perfect, inverted, we have perfect, major becomes minor, minor becomes diminished, augmented becomes diminished, diminished becomes augmented. So if we have a minor second and we do that 9 minus 2, we get a major 7th. We will discuss why by the end of this. Something that we can do with inverted intervals is create a nice musical phrase. So for example, if I go C, A, D, B, and E, C, just like this. And then after that, I follow it by the inverted version of intervals. So as you can see, it goes A, C, B, D, and C, E, just like this. Okay? So first, I'm going to play the first version, which is going to be 3/6 being played, and then next it's 3/3 being played, but the difference is in the first version, it's going to be inverted compared to the second version. So as you see, the notes kind of played off each other, and it created a nice little musical phrase. Okay, so we just looked at if we wanted to make an interval inverted in terms of the quantity. So we took for example, we did our second, and we did 9 minus 2, and we created our seventh. So there we're dealing with only quantity because we're dealing with numbers. So if we want to deal with quality, and we want to invert these qualities, we have to again deal with the chromatics. So we're going to be looking at the chromatics again, and we're going to be looking at these 12 chromatic notes, which make up the chromatic scale. So again, our 0 is going to be our first one that we start on, and then it goes all the way up to 12, which is then going to repeat on that same note 1 octave up. So since we start on the second note when counting chromatically, this is why our subtracted number becomes 12. So furthermore, since when counting up natural notes we begin on the note that we started on, our subtracted number is 9. So we do start our 1 on the note that we start on here. So we start on an A, and we call that a 1. So we know our 3, we're going to go A, B, C. So that's why we do our 9 minus 8 takes us to 1. So if we're inverting an interval, if we have an 8 octave, 9 minus 8 takes us to 1, takes us to the inverted version, takes us to the unison, the same note, but an inverted version of the intervallic relationship. Well, if we think of our first note of the chromatic scale as 0, then 12 minus 12 equals 0, which takes us back to the first note. As you can see, 12 is A, so we do 12 minus 12, that's going to take us back to the 0. So calling this 0 and calling this 12 is how we can make sense of this. So our octave, which was 12 steps, is now our unison, which is 0 steps. So next, I'm going to be talking about inverting an interval chromatically, and this is by subtracting the number of semitones by the number of 12. Okay, so to invert an interval chromatically, we subtract the number of semitones from 12. Like I was kind of just showing you earlier. So if we take A to A sharp, we have 1 semitone. So let's look at that. A to A sharp, 1 semitone. But if we invert that, now we're going to have A sharp to A. Okay, going up to there. So if we count up from there, and we already look 1 and we have 12, so 12 minus 1, we have those 11 steps. You can count it if you want. So next I move on to the augmented fourth or the diminished fifth, which actually share the same amount of 6 semitones. And this is because this is splitting the octave. So you have 12 semitones, and in the middle of that you have 6. So if you invert an A to a D sharp, you get D to A sharp, and no matter which way you count that, you get 6 semitones. Okay? Then I did the A to A, which is again the 0 semitones, and then I did the A to A sharp, which is the 12 semitones. Okay, so I'm not going to be filling in the rest of it, but I'm going to leave it here. So if you want to look at this, screenshot it, or write it down, you can fill in the blanks, and it would be a really good exercise for you to figure this stuff out further. So intervals can be dissonant or consonant in sound. Our dissonant intervals consist of the major second, the minor second, the augmented fourth, which is also known as the diminished fifth, then our major seventh, as well as our minor seventh. So dissonant is describing the sound of not being very settled. So it's not a stable sound, it's unstable in sound. While our consonant intervals are going to be describing a sound that is more stable. So this plays out good in music when you have the contradiction of certain sounds that kind of sound stable and certain ones that sound unstable, and sometimes the unstable ones then will be stabilized by a stable sound. And this is one of the very foundational things that occurs in music, the relationship between dissonance and consonance. So let's look at those consonant intervals. We have a major third, we have a minor third, we have a major sixth, we have a minor sixth, then we have a unison, which again on a piano, there's not two of the same note, so I'm just going to play the one note, but it would be two of those notes played together. Then I have my perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and then my octave, which can also be thought of as a perfect eight. So the unison, the 3, the 5, and the 8 are the strong consonances. This makes sense when we think about the overtone series, as well as the concept and idea that our ears like the major scale and chords. Sixths are not consonant enough to be able to end a phrase like a 1, 3, 5, or 8 would, yet they are still adequately consonant. A lot more consonant than any other dissonant interval that I'm going to be discussing. Because of this, they're good when creating a small rest in a song, and they are also good for creating a temporary suspended phrase. The strong dissonances are the 2 and the 7. These have a sound that some people describe as needing to be resolved, because these intervals by themselves sound very dissonant, and when they're resolved, it resolves that dissonant sound to a consonant sound. So again, it's like settling the sound. So if I want to resolve the 2, a fifth resolves it pretty nicely. Then if I want to resolve that minor seventh, an octave resolves that pretty nicely. So we're going from a strong dissonance to a strong consonance, and that's sort of settling down that dissonant, unsettled, unstable sound. The perfect fourth is unique because in some scenarios it sounds like a dissonance, but in other scenarios it sounds like a consonance. Usually when there are only two voices creating the perfect fourth, it is a dissonance. Dissonances and consonances relating to triads. So when two of the notes in a root position triad are the same two notes as another root position triad, they are consonant. But when two of the notes in a first inversion triad are the same, they are adequately consonant. If two notes are not in any triad, they are dissonant. If two of the notes in a second inversion triad are the same, they are adequately dissonant. So furthermore, we can look at the number of semitones in our consonant or dissonant intervals and relate that to our actual intervals that we have here. Okay, so first, because we're counting in semitones, we're counting chromatically. So we're calling our 0 that unison. So this would be two of the same notes being played. That's our 0. Then we go up to 3, which would be our minor third. Then we go up to 4, which would be our major third. And then we go up to 5, which would be our perfect fourth. And then we go up to 7, which would be our perfect fifth. And then we go up to 8, which then leads us to 8, which is our minor sixth. Then to 9, which is the major sixth. And then to 12, which is the octave. Now we look at dissonant. We're looking at the semitones again. We have 1 becomes our minor second. Our 2 is our major second. Next we go to 6 semitones, which takes us to that augmented fourth, which is also known as the diminished fifth, which they're calling a tritone here. Then we go up to 10 semitones, which takes us to a minor seventh. And then we go up to the 11 semitones, which is a major seventh. And those are the consonant and dissonant intervals and their number of semitones. So now let's take some of the things that we've learned and talk about enharmonic intervals. Enharmonic means one note or interval that is described as different names. So let's look at this a little further. We're going to look at up here the quantity, and we're going to look up counting the natural notes, and then here how we'd find our quality, but we're just going to be counting up the chromatic notes, and we're going to be figuring out an augmented fourth first. So let's start. Let's look at a fourth. So you go A to D. You can also just think A, B, C, D in your head or whatever. Or what I find the quickest is I go up a third. So we think A, C, and one up from C is D. And I find that the quickest. So we're going to go A to D, and we're going to see that 5 semitones is going to make that perfect fourth. So now I want to make an augmented fourth. So I want to raise this note by a semitone, and we already have that here. We have a D sharp. So if I go up the 6 semitones, I have an augmented fourth. So now I want to look at a diminished fifth. Okay? So I'm going to go A to my fifth, E. So now I'm going to look here. I'm going to go A to E. I have 7 semitones. Now I want to make a diminished fifth. So it'd go down 1. And now I would be calling this D sharp an E flat. And with this E flat, now we'd have 6 semitones. So as you can see, both of our intervals started from the A, which could be called 0, and then went to the 6, which was first D sharp, and then next was D flat, depending on the context if it was a fourth or if it was a fifth. But they're the same exact notes. So these are known as enharmonics. In this situation, we're going to be calling it, let's say it sounds to us like an augmented fourth. Maybe in this situation it sounds to us like a diminished fifth. Okay, so now let's look at a few more. I want an augmented second. So first we look at the quantity. I have a second, so I have A and B. Going up 2, we look at that here, and I know that 2 semitones is my major second, so I am able to make a major interval an augmented interval. So if I go up 1 semitone from this major second, I now am approached to my C, which in this case I could call my B sharp because it's 1 semitone past the B, and now I have an augmented second. This is 3 semitones. Okay, so next I want a minor third. So if I find a third, I have A, B, C, and I know that a minor third is 3 semitones. So when I look and I know that my first note is my 0, when I go up 3 semitones, I land here, but this is supposed to be a minor third, and right now it's an A to a B sharp, so it is still a quantity of a second. So I need to take it back to the original form of it being a C. So there are our enharmonics. So we also created enharmonic notes with this. So as you can see, B sharp is not the most common note that is referenced, but when someone does say B sharp, what they mean is C. They are the same note, so they're enharmonic notes. Next, I just fixed this. I don't know if you saw this or if you noticed this, but if you did, it's good. I fixed this. It did say D sharp before, and now it says E flat. So the note D sharp is the same note as E flat. They're the same exact note, but in certain situations, you're just going to call them different names. Okay, so now in this next example, we're going to be thinking about being in the key of C. Again, the key of C has no sharps and no flats, and this can kind of help us really understand at the base level what's going on here. So we're going to be thinking about if an interval is major or minor. Okay, so if we're working with sharps, and then in our set of chromatic notes in the chromatic scale, there are no B or E sharp. While when you're dealing with flats in the chromatic scale, you have no C or F flat. For these lessons, I will just be using the context of sharps to make it consistent, and I think it's also easier. And this is unless it makes more sense to think in the terms of flats. Then in that case, I will mention it is in flats, it'll be labeled or something. So we will be using this knowledge to help us quickly think about if an interval is major or minor by observing the notes being played and realizing where B or E is within those notes. So we will start in the context of C major scale to avoid any confusion. In other words, the notes we have to work with are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, but in the order of C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, which allows this to make a lot more sense. Okay, so now let's look at the interval thirds and how we can look at a third and know the two notes that are being played to create that and whether they are major or minor depending on where B or E is within that. Okay, so let's first look at some examples. We have the major, C to E. Okay, so if there's no B or E within the first two notes of the third, then there are no missing sharps or flats in that progression of notes, meaning that there are more steps compared to if there was a missing sharp or flat in that progression. So if we look at this first example, we have a major, and that's C to E. And why is it a major? And that's because the notes C and D both have sharps. So if we're thinking about that, we'd go C sharp, D, D sharp, then E when we're counting chromatically. So we'd have those four, and that makes a major. But the easier way to think about that is because there's no E on the first note or the second note, and it lands on an E, then there's no sharps being taken away from going from one note to the next note. So the fact that E does not have a sharp does not affect this at all, because if E did have a sharp, it would come after this and not within this progression from one note to the next note. Next we look at F to A, and if we spell that out, we have F, G, then A. As you can see, there's no B or E anywhere in that. So we know that we have our full progression of sharps. So we'd have our F sharp, we'd have a G, we'd have our G sharp, and then we'd land on our A. So we'd have those four semitones. And then for our last one, we have G and B. So we know that's a major because it's landing on the B, and in the middle of that we have G, A, and B. So we have our full set of the four semitones because the missing sharp comes at the last note, so it is not affecting us going from our G to ending on the B. Next, we're going to look at minor. So if we look at minor, we have first a D and an F. And if we think about DF, we have D, E, F. So we have an E in the middle. So we do have the E, which is missing a sharp. Since E is missing a sharp, we now have one less step in this progression. So let's count what's going on here. Remember, B and E do not have any sharps. Okay, so remember, counting chromatically, we start the first note on 0. So 0 is D, and then it's D sharp, E, and then we land on F with only our 3 semitones. And because we only have those 3 semitones, that means this is a minor third. But the easier, quicker way to know that is just the fact that there is an E in the middle, which means that it's going to cause one less sharp in the progression from D to F. Then this next one, we start on the E. So if we think about that, again, we're missing a sharp because the sharp comes after the note. So we're missing a sharp after the E. So if we count up that progression, we'd start our E on our 0, and then we'd have our F, F sharp, and we'd land on the G. So we'd only have those 3 semitones again, making it a minor third. Lastly, we have A and C, and we can think A, B, C. Okay, we have a B in the middle, so we know it's minor, but to break it down more, we could count up that again, and we can see the fact that B right here is missing a sharp. So we again have one less step in the progression from A to C, versus if, like here, we had no B or E in the middle or in the first note, or like if we had here or here to where our B and our E were on the end, which means that if the missing sharp was there, it comes after the note that we're already ending on. So here are some written dialogue and some notes about what I was just talking about. I wanted what was on the screen to be up at the moment, and then I wanted to scroll down to this after because there was kind of a lot to it. So if you want to pause this at all and read this, feel free. So to conclude that, with our third, 4 is the bigger number of semitones, and 3 is the smaller number, and 4 is the major third, and 3 is the minor third. Next, we can take this even further, and we can plug this into triads. So when we're looking at a major triad, we're going to again be looking at the position of this B and this E note. Okay, we got to know something about triads first, and that's if we stack a major third on a minor third, 4 semitones on 3 semitones, we get a major triad. If we stack a minor third on a major third, we get a minor triad. Okay, so we're looking at a C major triad. And how do we know it's major? Well, let's look. So we have a C to E as our 1 to our 3. So C, D, E. There's no B or E in the first 2 notes. There is an E on the last note. Because the E is on the last note, that sharp, that missing sharp, is now after the note that we're ending on. So it does not affect this at all. So we know from the previous lesson right before this that this is now a major third in this section. Then our next third, from 3 to 5, our E to our G, we do have a starting on our E, so we have a missing sharp. Since we have a missing sharp, we know that this triad is a minor. And since we know a major triad stacked on a minor triad is a major triad, now we know this is a major triad. And a very quick way to look at this is you just think C, E, G, oh, we're starting on E, so we have a missing sharp in that second half. Okay, so it's a minor triad because C to E is also C, D, and E. And you can do this pretty quickly in your head when you're used to doing it. So next we're going to look at F, A, C as a triad. So we're going to look at that first section again, that 1 to the 3, which is going to be F to A. F to A consists of F, G, and A. So we do not have any B or E's in there at all. So there's nothing affecting, so there's no missing sharps in that progression from F to A. Furthermore, if we go from A to C, we know our alphabet A, B, C, and we can also look here, there's a B in the middle of that triad, so that means there is a missing sharp. Because there is a missing sharp, this is a minor triad, which means we have a major triad, again stacked on a minor triad. And our last example is just going to have the B as the middle note instead of the E, so it's essentially the same thing as the first example, so now I'm going to go on to minor. So our minor triad, we have a D, F, and A. How do we know that this is a minor? Well, we can quickly think D, E, F, A. We know that E is missing a sharp, so we know that in our progression from D to F, we're missing that sharpened note. So D to F is a minor triad. This section is minor. Then we go from there, we go to F to A. Okay, so we go F, G, A, there's no B or E there, so we know that this section is a major triad. And we know that if we stack a minor third on a major third, we get a minor triad. Okay, so our next minor triad is EGB. We know EGB is a minor triad because E is missing a sharp. And in that first section, it goes E to G, which is E, F, G. So that first note we're starting from is already missing that sharp. Then we progress from G to B. So when we look at G to B, we do not have a missing sharp in here because we end on the B, so we're landing and ending the note on the B, and that missing sharp comes after that. So it's not affected, so we have a minor third and a major third after that. And those being stacked together creates a minor triad. And again, this last example of this B is just basically the same thing as this E, but the note is a B instead of an E, so I'm going to skip that. So in conclusion, we can use the same idea as thirds, as in triads, of realizing where our B or E is in our progression of notes, and if it's telling us if we have a major or minor, depending on if we have that missing sharp or not. Okay, next I have a combination lesson, which is combining a review of descending intervals as well as finding out the quality of an interval in any key now instead of just C major. Okay, some things to check for on any interval, whether it's ascending, descending, or it's played harmoniously, would be first the quantity, the number, and then second the quality, and you'd find the quality by looking at the key signature of the lowest note. Okay? Okay, so to find out the quality of any interval, we first find out which key this interval is in, and by doing so we look at the bottom note. So let's look at how we do this. So we have an E going down to a C. So it's descending. So we're still going to call this a third, and because we're descending, we're counting down the notes E, D, and then C, which gives us our third. That's first our quantity. That's our first step. We know we have a third. That's our interval. Now to find out, is it major? Is it minor? Okay, so we're going to look at the key of the lowest note. How do we do this? We look at what the lowest note is, and we figure out what key it is. So we have a C. In the key of C, we don't have flats, we don't have sharps. Okay, well I have an E here, and I know that to find my third, I'm going to go from this note to that note. So I go from this note to that note, and I have a C to an E, but there's no flats and there's no sharps. And I know this is a major third because in the key of C, there are no flats and no sharps. And because I just have an E here, that note is where it's supposed to be, and this is a major. So I know this is a major third because in the key of C, there are no flats and there are no sharps, and what I have here has no flats and has no sharps. Okay, so let's go next. If I'm going from C to E, it's the same thing because remember, descending or ascending, it's still a third. So we'd essentially do the same exact thing. We just look at the fact that we're in the key of C, no sharps, no flats, and our note here is just an E. It's not flat, it's not sharp, so that's good. We have a major. Okay, so our next note goes ascending from E to G. So it goes E, F, G, and we know we have a third, and we can also see that by looking at the sheet music. But now, is it a major or is it a minor third? And you may be able to tell already by the lesson that I taught before this if this is a minor or major third, but the whole point of this lesson is that this works for any key. So no matter what note you have, you can use this method and you can figure out what your intervallic relationship is in terms of quality. Okay, so when we look at the bottom note from E to G, we know that we're going to be in the key of E. So first, when we're looking at keys, we need to figure out how many sharps are going to be in that key. Then after that, we figure out which notes those sharps are. So first, we take this phrase and we start on the G. And starting on the G allows us to progress in an order that tells us how many sharps we have in the key we're working in. So let's look at what we say. We have an E here on the line. So we go G, D, A, E. So we have those 4 sharps. What are those 4 sharps? Well, we go down now to the second line, which is our order of sharps, and those 4 sharps are F, C, G, and D. So since F, C, G, and D should be sharp, we have a G, F, C, G, D should be sharped. Our G is not sharped. If you look at it, there's nothing saying it's sharp, so we have a minor third here. Okay, again, if we're looking at it, then again descending, we'd still have that minor third because we're going to be counting from this bottom note up. Okay, so next I'm going to be looking at the descending notes of C to E. So if we think C to E, we're going to be descending, so we either need to count from C back to E, so we have C, B, A, G, F, and E, or we can count up and we can count from E to C. So we go E, F, G, A, B, C. Either way, we have a sixth. And now we want to know if we have a major or a minor sixth. So again, we're going to look at the bottom note and we're going to figure out which key we're in. So the bottom note tells us that we're in the key of E, and the key of E, if we're looking at from starting at G, we're going to go G, D, A, E, again those four sharps, and again those four sharps are going to be F, C, G, and D. So since we have an F, C, G, and D, our C is in there, F, C, G, D. So since we have that C in there, our C actually should be sharped in the key of E, and it's not saying it's sharp anywhere here, so we're looking at a minor sixth. And a quick way to think about the fact that it's a minor sixth is to think that if we invert the sixth, if we go 9 minus 6, we have a third, and remember, if we take a minor and we invert it, becomes a major. If we have a major, we invert it, becomes a minor. So we already know that if we invert the E to C, we now have a C to E. And if we have a C to E, it's a third. But if we're remembering that rule to where we are ending on that E, so there's not that missing sharp in there. So we already know that CE is a major third, and therefore the inverted version of it, the sixth, is a minor sixth. Okay, so to kind of talk about this a little more, when finding the amount of sharps a key has, you start on that G, but when finding out what those sharp notes are, you start on F. So why do we do this? This is because G is the first key going from C around the circle of fifths clockwise, and C has no sharps in it, so G has one sharp, which is my F. So we use this to find out how many sharps it has. So my G has one sharp, and that sharp is F. So then additionally, if I go one up from there, I'm going to have a D, which then has my next sharp in it, which then if you look is a C. So my next is a D. So now I have those two sharps, and those two sharps are the sharp that I have now and the one that came before it. Well, if I had my F would have my 6 sharps, so my F would have all of these sharps put together, you see? So each of the new additional progressions going clockwise adds these sharps on it. And it's the same thing when you're going on flats, when you're progressing down the flats, you see that the flats are going to add on each other. Another way to look at which key you're in and find out which note is sharp in that key, you can think one note back from the note that you have. So if you think G, you can quickly know that one note back from G is F, and that is your sharpened note in that key. Again, if you think D, if you think one note back from D is C, and that is the new additional sharpened note in this key. Okay, so now we're going to look at if we have a key that is going down the circle of fifths counterclockwise. Okay, so that's the note F, and then all these other notes have a flat on them. And the saying to remember that is the bead GCF, and if you look, you can see that here as BEAD, G, C, and then F is the one that does not have the flat. Okay, so I still kept the same interval of my C going down to my E, so it's still the 6th, but I turned my E to E flat. So remember now our bottom note is the note that is telling us which key that we're in. So we know we're in the key of E flat. When we're looking at flats, we're going to look at this progression of notes starting on F. So if we look at this progression of notes starting on F and we go to E, we go F, B, and then E. So it's telling us we have 3 flats in the key of E flat. We know it's the key of E flat because we know that F is the only key in all these rest of these keys that is not flattened. So we know that we're in the key of E flat. We know that E flat has 3 flats in it, 3 flats in its key, and we can then go to our order of flats and find out what those flats are. So we have B, E, and A. In other words, B flat, E flat, and A flat. And if we look here, we have the note C. Okay, so in this key we need a B, E, and an A flat. So look over here. Do we have a B, E, or A? We do have an E, but the E is already flat, so that checks off. We have a C. Since C is not supposed to be flat in this key, and it's not flat in this key, it's where it's supposed to be, and we have a major sixth. Here are some more notes about this topic. Okay, so to kind of sum this up, you see the interval up from the lowest note, and you see if it should be sharp or flat. Then you check if the note is a natural, sharp, or flat in the state that it's in right now to check and figure out the quality of the interval. Descending or ascending are the same, just in ascending the notes are flipped compared to in descending. The both are the same when notated in harmony. But when changing the quality of the interval, if it is not what you want, you can only change the second note, whether it is ascending or descending, to be sharp or flat to create your new quality. This is because your first note in the interval is still the foundational note of the interval, then the second note is being built from that, but when we're showing you how to figure out the quality and the quantity, you need to count up from the lowest note because that shows us the relationship between the two notes. Okay, so now I want to create a minor sixth from my major sixth. So I have my major sixth here, and I have the note C to E flat. And because C to E in terms of quantity is a sixth, I still need to stay in that same quantity. So I still need to have a note that goes from C to E, but I need to change the quality of the E note to be different somehow, so then this interval is a now minor sixth. In order to do this, I'm going to think, what other key could I be in besides E flat? And well, if I'm in the key of E, well then again, I'm going to think G, D, A, E. I have those four sharps, and then I'm going to think those sharps are F, C, G, and D. And because I have a C in there, and I have a C on this line, well now I know that this C should be sharp, but it's not. So now this is now a minor sixth. Okay, so that concludes Music Monday episode 4, all about intervals. I'm going to leave you with a circle of fifths that is basically blank. The only thing filled in is the C major and the A minor scale, and then with the direction of going up your fifths or going down by fifths, and tells you a kind of little key base here of if you're going down counterclockwise, what to follow, up counterclockwise, the directions, and then furthermore up clockwise and down clockwise. Thank you very much. If you have any additional comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below or even message me, and I would love to respond. Thank you very much.